One's for sorrow, two's for joy, three's for a girl and four's for a boy, five's for silver, six for gold, seven's for a secret never told.
By the clicking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes.
There were lots of things that were in the air, and I think that in the 1970s you had one of the very first periods in the 20th century British history where people, for a long time anyway, where people became convinced that actually Britain wasn't kind of great. You come out of the 60s, which is a very celebratory era, and suddenly you have a period of austerity. You have a government that calls an election thinking they're going to smash it, and then it goes a bit wrong. You have a big divisive referendum about Europe. Over the pond, you have an American president who's going through like a 2-year-long scandal about things he did wrong in his re-election campaign. None of these things are sort of exist in isolation. So you also have like this big rise in interest in the occult.
Jet white dove, snowblack snake, time has turned his face from the edge of mystery where running is no race. Ageless night, careless day, fate reaches out a hand to touch the edge of destiny, a story with no end.
A lot of witchcraft going on in the late 60s, which is becoming a more prevalent idea amongst young, educated intellectuals. It's no longer just a thing that the country folk do. When you have like the films of Kenneth Anger, there's this kind of sense that witchcraft is becoming
This is a modern thing.
A modern
magic
thing.
can be modern, it's not just something in the past.
The factories were closing, so the kids went off travelling. They followed the Beatles, really, to India.
Far from the noise and pace of city life, in the cool, clear air of Rishikesh, North India, Pathé News reports from the meditation retreat of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi.
They discovered cheap drugs, they discovered different ways of life, they discovered entire ways of being that were intact for thousands of years, and that intrigued them. And they came back here and wanted to know, well, where's England's one? How do we do it? Witchcraft is the only religion that the UK has ever given to the world. And it was so popular amongst musicians and people. And so, because famous people were, the rest of people followed. And it just grew and grew and grew from there.
And it's not like everybody knew a spiritualist medium or knew a pagan, but everybody knew someone who knew a pagan.
Lonely, Diana desired a lover. That desire became the dawn. And from the dawn came the sun, Lucifer, the god of light.
Pagan and sort of folk culture is very much part of where I'm from. Like when I was at school, we'd do quote-unquote country dancing, which was the sort of thing you see in the Wicker Man, where we'd go out and we'd dance around the maypole. Christian festivals like Candlemas and Harvest Festival were intertwined with these sort of folk customs. So it was very much part of the local culture to integrate these two things, because traditionally Christianity and paganism have always been sort of meshed.
And so, at this time of fulfillment of the country year, let our thoughts return to that one source from which all good gifts come from, to bring it forth once more in the spring, when the green shoots pierce the earth, in praise of the only begetter of all our goodness.
This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This oft as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this wine, you do show the Lord's death till he comes again.
For the 1973 film The Wicker Man, director Robin Hardy and scriptwriter Anthony Shaffer researched with books such as The White Goddess by Robert Graves and The Golden Bough by James Fraser. Now, these books have since been questioned by academics and scholars as to the authenticity of the folk customs and religious rites which are contained within the books. You have certain things such as the Mummers Parade, you have the Hand of Glory, you have the Wicker Man itself, the existence of which was quoted in Roman times by Roman invaders, and it still isn't known whether it was a clever piece of propaganda or whether people in the Celtic and Gaulish countries did actually burn animals and possibly other people as sacrifices within giant humanoid wicker structures.
Of course, the difficulty is there's no Bible of what these customs were, so often you're connecting it with revived or reinvented customs via modern witchcraft and people like Doreen Valiente, who was the doyen of what we think of as traditional things that, well, they had their roots in tradition, but they were invented. But movies will always need to go for what looks good on screen, so they may well play their own game. And sometimes it's frustrating for a folklorist because what it says in the movie becomes the folklore.
What's this? Tell me. Do you believe in magic?
You also have a film such as Robert Eggers' The Witch, which I love for the elements of witchcraft that have not appeared in film beforehand. The things such as the transformation into a hare.
The hare is a huge part of folklore in Western Europe, particularly the British Isles, but we don't really have hares. There's jackrabbits out west in Native American mythology, but we don't, in New England we didn't really have that, so that whole line was lost.
The pulverizing of a baby's body to make flying ointment, the signing the Book of Shadows, things like this relate to stuff such as the Malleus Maleficarum and the discovery of witches.
Witches is one area where we do have more of a folk horror tradition in the United States because of the Salem witch trials and because the Puritans wrote everything down. New England was the most literate place in the Western world in the 17th century. Cotton Mather being one of, tons and tons and tons of Puritans who were obsessive about writing things down.
Memorable Providences relating to witchcraft and possession by Cotton Mather. I read from it all the time.
The witch is a source of persistent fascination and consternation throughout the world. This is true in Africa, this is true in Europe, this is true in the South Pacific, and this is true in the United States. And it really begs questions about how uncomfortable humanity as a whole has been with feminine power.
I think as well because of the sort of feminist readings you can make of folk horror specifically because of the witch figure and its and goddesses and this connection to femininity.
And I think that's reflected also in Night of the Eagle, which is a film with Peter Wingard, also about a sort of very rational guy who's a college lecturer, but his wife has been doing witchcraft to sort of protect his position at the school. And he says, that's stupid, we shouldn't use witchcraft anymore, we're modern, we're rational. And she is stopped from doing this witchcraft stuff, and then bad stuff starts to happen to him. So there's this sense that even though he's rational, even though he chooses not to believe in it, maybe the old forces still have power.
I want some kind of explanation.
What is it, obvious? I'm a witch.
When we think of horror cinematically, We're looking at a male-dominated genre from the end. We're looking at the Draculas, the Frankensteins, you know, and that sort of thing. And then by the time it gets to the 60s, we start to see more powerful female characters. Things in like Hammer's The Witches.
We have all these different figures that we're fascinated with. The zombie, the vampire, the werewolf. We're fascinated with issues of reincarnation, all these things that touch upon the supernatural, but none like the witch. And that puts us in front of a huge question.
When you look at traditionally witches, we have this idea of the hag, this old woman, the medicine bringer. Traditionally, she would have been the midwife, the doctor. She would have had a purpose in the community. She would have had power.
It's impossible to understand the development of the suffragist movement in America without understanding how it was entwined in its DNA with American occultism. The two were absolutely joined.
In the 1800s, when you had occult belief and occult activity become more prominent, you saw prominent female figures holding high-ranking. Look at Madame Blavatsky. She founded the Theosophical Society. You know, high priestesses like Moina Mathers, who came out of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
The earliest spirit mediums, when the movement of spiritualism swept the country, were women. And this became the first time in modern life that women could serve as religious leaders of a certain sort.
And I think it's this thing of women having power that makes it so scary.
The witch represents men's fears and fantasies and ambivalencies about women and female power and female sexuality. She also embodies women's own fears and anxieties about their power in themselves in a male-dominated society to some extent. Certainly that's what the evil fairy tale witch is.
Even if you look at something like Benjamin Christensen's silent film Haxan, there's this connection between mental illness and witchcraft. And he sort of points out this idea that maybe these figures aren't evil, maybe they're not supernatural, maybe they're just different for a wide variety of reasons. And I think to me that's the common thread, is this female type that's existing outside of what is expected of her and what she's supposed to be.
We all have things that have become our folk traditions.
When we get to the 80s and 90s, the witch has become girl power. It's become the witches of Eastwick. It's become the craft. It's become cool to be this powerful witchy figure.
You know, because we are marvellous, because we are still the renegades. And we're happy to be the renegades. I don't want to be respectable, thank you very much.
Girls, watch out for those weirdos.
We are the weirdos, mister.
So I think that's why the witch of all monsters is the most dangerous, because she represents feminine world takeover.
It's impossible to really understand the history of this country unless one understands that religious experimentation, religious radicalism was there at its very, very root. Going back to the 1600s, the US colonies were considered a safe harbor for people with radical religious beliefs. All kinds of different little mystical Christian grouplets from throughout Europe. And that inspired people to found their own colonies. And very early on in American colonial history, you start to hear about things that we later came to call seances and channeling and mediums, and people were sort of branching off into these little grouplets. It was a very, very rural country. You really had very little social life outside of farm, trade, and church. And people would experiment. They would form either into pre-existing fraternal orders like Freemasonry, or they would form their own little colonies.
Mr. Will said we'd start our own settlement in the Promised Land. He said if we just floated down the river, it would find us.
I first used the term folk horror in 2006 when I was writing a book called American Gothic, and on that occasion I referred to a 1923 silent film called Puritan Passions as folk horror. And that film is now lost, but it was based on stories by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was a 19th century contemporary of Edgar Allan Poe's, and he had a very personal stake in America's ancestral folk horror, if you like, in that one of his had been a judge at the Salem trials.
Fasten your seatbelts, everybody. Harold is about to conduct another tour to the 17th century.
17th century. That was in the Puritan times, wasn't it?
This idea of the recognition that the community in the wilderness could turn against itself with really frightening speed. Now, the spectre of the colony that fails is one of the most powerful anxieties in the American psyche, and it manifests itself time and time again in the rural Gothic and in folk horror.
Most American horror, American Gothic, like Stephen King, has its roots in the same European witchcraft anxiety. So Salem's Lot, you know, Pet Sematary, although Pet Sematary has its First Nations, Native American narrative too.
Yeah, so the Puritans are weird. They believed a lot of weird stuff. When they arrived to the Americas, they thought the New England colonies would be like paradise. And so when they realized that there were other people here that had been here for many, many years before, they basically read them as like manifestations of Satan. And so Native Americans, according to Puritans, were put on this earth to basically test them. As we get into the development of like an American literary tradition, we get indigenous ghosts. It renders indigenous people as sort of inevitably going to disappear, as like a sort of ontological status of indigenous people, just like something that is part of their being that's inevitably going to happen. And not that indigenous people are disappearing because of intentional actions by white settlers that destroyed their cities and their lands and their languages and disrupted families. So it sort of takes some of the guilt off of settlers. It sort of obviously others indigenous people, and they're so other that they're like otherworldly. We're all ghosts. We have these mystical, magical powers. We can return and give you our knowledge or haunt you. You know, indigenous stories matter, but indigenous people don't matter in this framework. It's that, you know, we want all of the good stuff that your cultures have, like your knowledge and your practices and your sort of ability to navigate the environment and be good caretakers of the environment, but we don't want you.
A few years ago, there was millions of Indians, see? They covered this land like buffaloes, living their Indian ways and practicing their strange tribal rites. Tribes varied, as they will do, but one hard and fast rule known to damn near every white man was that you don't go kicking around their cemeteries, because that's sacred ground.
Look, there's no such thing as an Indian burial ground. So full stop. Let's start with that. So when I think of the Indian burial ground in movies, I think of a plot device. I think of a figment of the Western imagination.
Construction started in 1907. It was finished in 1909. The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground, and I believe they actually had to repel a few Indian attacks as they were building it.
Well, there's Ojibwe burial grounds, there's Mohawk burial grounds, there's Cree burial grounds. These are not Indian burial grounds. When you reduce a multinational people into Indian, which is what Hollywood has done pretty effectively for, you know, its entire history. You know, you're working in fiction.
This was their burial ground.
Whose burial ground?
Micmac Indians.
The Indian burial ground trope in fiction goes back to the 18th century, but when Stephen King was writing Pet Sematary, Jimmy Carter had just signed the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act after a decade-long, highly publicized legal battle. And controversy over the ownership of indigenous land, artifacts, and remains was a focal point in 1970s indigenous activism.
We don't want to be a Canadian citizen. We don't want to be American citizen. We have feel this way because we think that this reservation is ours. And it does not belong to the white man. It's the only part we still have left.
They got no right here on the reservation.
Both America and Canada, you know, are functionally illegal nation states that exist through broken treaties between other nations that predate them by millennia. So there's always going to be an anxiety in those places. Whether they actually would recognize it consciously, they're actually deeply, deeply aware of the violence and oppression that was necessary for them to exist. You know, I think a lot of American horror movies are actually informed by the colonial history of America, in that the thing that colonial states fear the most is to be colonized. When we talk about that, the fear that it generates in non-Indigenous people boils down to this sort of innate feeling that someone is going to come and take your home from you. And what do most Indian burial ground movies involve? Someone building their house on top of an Indian burial ground.
You're living on some sort of special ground. Devil worship, death, sacrifice. George, there's one simple rule. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change forms.
As more Indigenous people start to make movies, I think then we'll start to see greater representation. I'll tell you one other thing about the Indian burial ground, though, is that I sort of like it. Because if non-Indigenous people are going to be afraid of the Indian burial ground, then I got some news for you. It's all an Indian burial ground.
As the site of the white settlers' ancestral horror, we return to New England again and again throughout the history of American horror fiction. Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, I mean, there's film adaptations of that going back as far as 1922. There's definitely a tradition of folk horror in America, also in things that utilize stories of shipwrecks and mariners' ghosts.
I would have to include remarkable films like All That Money Can Buy as well, which was made by RKO in 1941, known under various titles, The Devil and Daniel Webster, or Daniel and the Devil, in which an impecunious rural farmer is given the opportunity to improve his station in life by a character called Mr. Scratch, and it's not very difficult to work out who Mr. Scratch is.
Dog! Stop!
I mean, like, even Lovecraft flirts with folk horror, but with his own mythos, it becomes like bogged down in a lot of occulty specificity that I think makes it no longer folk horror.
Obviously, in Lovecraft, there was no, in a way, it was much more ascetic as a religious discourse, if you want to call it that. But ultimately, the old gods, they were old gods of some other tradition.
Lovecraft's genius was his capacity to create this internally consistent, self-sustaining world in which the gaslit certainties of the Victorian age were being challenged by the reemergence of these primordial gods.
So the writing of H.P. Lovecraft in particular often featured these very fraught encounters between unwary travellers and degenerate country folk. In his tremendously creepy, another story of his called The Picture of the House, the narrator even urges, I think he uses the phrase, the true epicure in the terrible, to esteem, as he puts it, the ancient, lonely farmhouses of New England. And this is a story that concludes with this incredibly tense and sort of horrific revelation of pagan ritual and cannibalistic practices, which have been, of course, this is Lovecraft, imported overseas to a New England rural setting.
All right, fellas.
To me, that the real sort of like proto-folk horror tale is Shirley Jackson's The Lottery.
Acts of communal togetherness in Shirley Jackson's work actually relatively often involve mob violence or the fear of mob violence.
It's Tessie.
I think it could be argued that her close-knit rural communities are never more united than when they close ranks against an outsider. This is very much the case, of course, in her final novel, We've Always Lived in the Castle, but, most famously of all, in The Lottery, where the ultimately sort of sacrificial victim, Tessie Hutchinson, becomes a symbolic outsider through this random act of selection. But as critics, such as, for instance, a guy called Fritz Ulschlager, who was writing in 1988, have pointed out, Tessie's fate is actually potentially telegraphed by her name. In 1637, a woman named Anne Hutchinson was forcibly expelled from the Massachusetts colony for her antinomian beliefs. And so Hutchinson is a name associated with female rebellion and punishment within the wider context of New England history. So whilst the ritual carried out at the climax of The Lottery might seem to have little initial connection to Christianity, both the method of execution, which is of course stoning, and the name of the scapegoat, Hutchinson, suggest this link between pagan ritual and the Christian appropriation of such rites.
There's always been a lottery.
Is this your land?
Yeah.
How come you don't use machinery?
Against the ways.
Religious ways?
No, just tradition.
There would be films such as the television serial of Thomas Tryon's Harvest Home, which was given the name of The Dark Secret of Harvest Home, featuring Betty Davis.
Thomas Tryon's novel Harvest Home is set in an ancient New English village, as it's called in the novel, whose residents, like Shirley Jackson's townfolk in The Lottery, have a very unusual way of ensuring a good harvest.
And so it will continue forever. The eternal return.
I would argue that Tryon's novel can be read in part as a kind of reflection of contemporary male anxiety about the rise of feminism. We're talking about the early 1970s here, after all. At the climax of the novel, the family breadwinner ends up thoroughly emasculated, both literally and thematically. And of course, the women in his life, his wife and his daughter, both end up very happily embracing the old matriarchal ways.
The time when
folk horror was having its first wave in the 70s also coincided with a time when a lot of alternative religions were forming communities.
If what I have to say to you is true, you see where being in such a family benefits you.
Utopianism is embedded in the very fabric of the American dream, and these kinds of communal experiments flourished in the United States as they did nowhere else.
Midsummer's set in Scandinavia, but it's an American film, and it's deeply informed by the anxiety around cults in America. The conflict isn't really between like a new religion and an old religion as much as it's about societal norms, about intimacy and support and grieving, and the way that modern society does not really leave space and time for people to grieve properly. You have this older community that is a more nurturing community and a more welcoming and supportive community. And I think that's still the reason why people join cults, is because the modern world does not really leave enough space for us to experience connection.
Dedicated my life to God. Praise the Lord. Hallelujah. Only because she believed.
And the interesting thing about cults in North America is that most of them are actually different iterations of Christianity. So it's not like with British folk horror where you have Christian religions, which are considered the more contemporary modern religions, and the older pagan religions. In a lot of the American folk horror films, it's actually weird Christians.
You can hear it if you open your ears. He's gonna tell you all just what you want. Gonna get you in your ears. All the cycles of the end showing. That's just years ago. Oh, the lives are getting harder. Without Christ, you don't know where to go.
So this archaic way of life, this devotion to the old ways, I think evokes very strongly parallels with religious sects such as the Amish and the Mennonites. I think there's definitely a sort of a conflation and a correlation happening here between fears of dangerous sort of rogue cults and uncertainty about isolated but obviously pacifist communities like the Amish. I think there's a real anxiety here about what happens when those kinds of people, being kind of rural, religious fundamentalists, are left to their own devices. A suspicion about, what will they get up to when they're left on their own with no external oversight.
It inevitably made its way into these films, especially when you've got a lot of these communities moving into rural areas. It becomes very tied in with the tropes and imagery that we associate with folk horror.
Behold! A dream did come to me in the night, and the Lord did show all this to me.
Praise God! Praise the Lord!
Also, in Children of the Corn, the fact that they are a Christian religion, with Isaac altering the Bible based on dreams he had, is very reminiscent of Mormonism. The way that they are Christians, with Joseph Smith publishing the Book of Mormon as a companion piece to the Bible, claiming that he was shown the location of ancient writings on golden plates during a visit from an angel of God named Moroni.
I think people are also frightened by fundamentalism.
You look at Isaac and Malachi, and you look at the way they're dressed, and you look in the town, they don't allow games anymore, and they don't have any televisions anymore, they don't have any telephones anymore. It's all about the crop, and they don't have any of these modern conveniences.
It does reflect a lot of the anxieties that people have about what people do sacrifice when they go into these communities.
That's really going on. I mean, it's like it starts with the poisoning of the coffee pot. Before they started shooting that, people were dying because of poisoned Kool-Aid.
These references to Jonestown in Stephen King's Children of the Corn are, I think, directly tied to this foundational horror of the colony that sort of splits off and self-destructs. So religious migration to escape perceived persecution was really nothing new at all, even when the Puritans did it. And it is a journey that I think in many respects Jonestown replicated as well. The People's Temple in Guyana was actually one of the sites that the Puritans had initially considered going to before they decided upon New England as their destination. So there's actually a really fascinating coincidental overlap between the Puritans and the People's Temple in this respect.
American Prairie horror, you don't see it a lot. When we're in a horror movie, it's usually that the walls are coming in on us and that we're in this space and we are so closed in and it's claustrophobic. But with the prairie, you can strangely have the same feeling of this claustrophobia in this place where you can see everything.
In 1973, Michael Lisi published the book Wisconsin Death Trip, fashioned entirely out of 19th century photographs and newspaper reports from the isolated community surrounding a place called Black River Falls, Wisconsin. And collectively, they tell a story of crime, death, and insanity that fuels this narrative that isolation breeds sickness.
I lived in Ottawa, Kansas. We joined a community-supported agriculture garden. I was out there one day with just a bunch of women who were working in the garden, and they kept talking to me and asking me questions. And we're in Kansas, it's very flat, and the wind is just insane that day, and I couldn't hear anything. One of the women links arms with me, and she's like, you know what used to drive women crazy? And I asked her, what did? And she said, the wind. It used to drive women crazy out here.
One of the things that Teresa was referencing when she wrote the script was a book called Pioneer Women. And a lot of those women were coming from other countries. A lot of people settling at that time were immigrants. In this case, from Germany, there would have been a whole other batch of both spirituality and religious beliefs that she was coming with in prayers, as well as maybe some folklore as well.
This land, there's something wrong with it.
There's blood in the kitchen, and there's blood in the hall, and there's blood in the parlor where the lady did fall. And Lambkin is a hanging on the high gallows tree, and the nurses are burning in the fire close by. Oh, the death bell is a knelling for lady and baby, and the green grass is a growing all over there.
Many of the settlers who came to Appalachia and associated frontier regions during this fourth big wave of British migration came from areas like the Scottish borders, or they were descendants of Scottish Presbyterian planters whose family had originally, several generations back, settled in the east or the north of Ireland. They tended to be independently minded, they tended to be very resilient, they tended to be very adaptable.
These people wanted to pull themselves away from the mainstream or what had become of their culture at the time.
Low income is not what we are, we're poor people.
I think low income is people that maybe has a way of just getting by, but poor people is the ones that don't know where the next dollar's coming from.
Some of the ways in which these Appalachian communities differed from the dominant settler culture was because they were an essentially classless society. They had a lack of respect or interest in centralized authority, and they tended to live in insular, close-knit family groups rather than in these larger settlements. There sort of arose this perception that they clung to what you might call, the old ways, that they were intensely superstitious, that they preferred the sort of blood feuds between themselves without recourse to the law. And this is, of course, a perception that really lingers to this day.
While the women plows and makes the corn and the man shoots turkey and deer.
Look on the face of death. Never feel your baby's breath. Cassie, stop it. Look on the face of death. Never feel.
Earl Handler Walt, great presentation folk screen, and in addition to a couple of Woodlands episodes that get into the realm of folk horror, he also wrote a beloved Twilight Death about a woman who makes a deal with the local witch to ensnare the man who rejected her.
My mama says that when you see a fallen star, that means a witch has just died.
It's a really great use of those kinds of rural folk legends that you get in Appalachia and the more distant parts of America. There's a writer called Manly Wade Wellman who wrote a whole series of stories about this guy called Silver John, and he had a guitar with strings made of silver. There was a guy who wandered around the countryside getting involved in various adventures that always seemed to involve local folk and things.
The American film The Fool Killer was referred to in 1965 as an offbeat folk horror film.
Almost think you believe that story.
Never felt like there was some sort of something like the Fool Killer? You never done things you'd known was just plain foolish and felt like you was gonna have to pay the price?
The Fool Killer movie was directly based on a novel by Helen Eustace, but its central character, a roving philosophical murderer who rids the world of fools, he had become late century. His enduring appeal possibly fact. He's in a society considered himself turnables and him and he kind of adhere.
I got it when I'm folks too don't. Strange houses is a place of my enemies, George.
Folk express ambivalence about progress. And so often in these films, through the production design, the old dialects and stuff, you get the idea that this culture is just holding on for dear life.
No! I know who the next jug face is. It's me.
And so many of these stories are about sacrifice and protagonists resistant to the sacrifice necessary to keep the culture alive.
I think of things like Pumpkinhead, where, it's very specific to that region. So I think that also plays a big part where it's set and the method of the people that live in that community.
What killed him? City folks. Run him over. Looking for an old woman. She lives somewhere in the mountains hereabouts.
Deliverance probably brought that in, actually, the sort of idea of the stereotype of the hillbilly. And so we started to see the sort of different idea of what the South was like.
So the early 1970s was very much a period for the American cinema screen where you had these kinds of backwoods anxieties manifesting themselves very openly on screen. But really these films were tapping into very long established stereotypes about degeneracy, particularly amongst Southern hill folk. Between 1880 and around 1820, the so-called Eugenics Record Office, the ERO, produced a series of eugenic family studies. And what they wanted to do here was demonstrate that large numbers of particularly poverty-stricken rural whites were so-called genetic defectives. And according to this logic, the stagnation, the decrepitude, the poverty of their surroundings, and the proximity of the wilderness had bred in them this kind of dangerous primitivism which could erupt into violence at any time.
All the salts around here are rotten, and it gets worse the further down you go.
The film is basically set in a sort of a backwater town that's almost impossible to get to except by this old bus.
Those people, oh God, those people. Nobody liked those people. It's the way they look. They call it straw.
H.P. Lovecraft was shot in the big one of the whole
Just the idea that these people from the rest of the world is, I think, an example of kind of what happened after the Civil War with, you know, just how it was devastated financially.
You should know from 100 years ago, and 100 years we've waited now to tell. Now the Yankees come along and they'll listen to this song and they'll quake in fear to hear this rebel yell. Quake in fear to hear this rebel yell. Yeah! Oh, the South's gonna rise again.
You can't really talk about the South without having a little bit of a trickle in of effects of the Civil War.
This perception that the South had been left behind was exacerbated by the fact that it actually had a very considerable basis in reality. The poverty of the rural South, it wasn't just some kind of theory, it was something that affected the lives of ordinary people in a myriad of ways every single day of their lives.
Even things like, I think, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you know, can certainly be placed within the realms of folk horror.
You like this, Dave?
You get this idea that people are on the land for so long that something happens to the family unit, where there's this idea of corruption and cruelty, where there's this sense that family is not a place of love and warmth, but a place where a lot of dark secrets are concealed and people's violent natures are given free rein.
I was born and raised here, and my daddy before me. I seen things in these woods no man's supposed to see, and I know things no man's supposed to know. These woods be a strange place.
In many ways, folk horror arises out of the Gothic itself, and particularly Southern Gothic. Southern Gothic grows out of Reconstruction anxieties, the sense that the South, despite being devastated, has supposedly been caught up to the rest of the nation's industry through government legislation, and that's been caught up to the nation's racial ideas, again, through government legislation. What we see in the Southern Gothic is an anxiety that perhaps this progress isn't progress at all. Perhaps it's as horrible as the old ways. Equally problematic when we think about writers such as Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner. Perhaps all of it is pretension. Perhaps the old genteel ways were horrible, not just to people of color, but to whites of lower class standing. Perhaps that genteel nature merely meant hiding the horror, ignoring it and masking it as something beautiful and kind. But maybe modernization and industry is equally horrible and alienating. Maybe there's no winner on either side and we're ultimately all monsters still.
local band.
If you have stories that are taking place down south, very often the regional specific elements are either voodoo or hoodoo. And one of the problems that filmmakers have experienced over the years is being unable to distinguish between voodoo and hoodoo, and they are very different.
Voodoo's a religion. Slaves brought to Haiti from Africa. Worship God, heaven, hell. How's hoodoo different? It's magic. American folk magic. God doesn't have much to do with it.
When you talk about hoodoo, what you're essentially talking about is a magical folk practice that is often divorced from religion, and as such is also divorced from the moral and ethical codes that go along with religion.
Some things are better left unsaid. I paid you $1, old woman. Now tell my fortune.
As Michelet said, Jules Michelet wrote the book on sorcery. Witchcraft and sorcery is always a religion of an oppressed people.
Also, when we talk about voodoo's role in thinking about folk horror, we're also talking about the haunting, again, of slave history, and more particularly slave rebellion. This rebellion starts off deep in the forests of Haiti's mountains, in a remote location called Bois Caimon, and it's led by a maroon leader named Bookman. We trace the power of this rebellion, its success, and essentially the rise of Haiti back to a voodoo ceremony. And what you see in much of the 19th century is an anxiety around voodoo and Black practitioners of voodoo and mystical religious practices.
As sure as my name is Boris Karloff, you will witness fantastic events in this thriller. Events as dark as the jungle where the voodoo rites and voodoo drums were first seen and heard. It may even lead you to wonder what you yourself could accomplish with just an ordinary pin and a doll shaped like someone of whom you're not particularly fond.
So when we look, for instance, at films like White Zombie, Awanga, I Walked with a Zombie, Voodoo Black Exorcist, we see in many cases voodoo represented but divorced of its religion. Instead, what voodoo becomes is an ominous sound in the distance, suggesting evil is beginning to arise and make incursions upon proper white authority. So when we think about particularly the films coming out in the late and mid 80s, such as The Serpent and the Rainbow, The Believers, and Angel Heart, it emphasizes it as a corruptive influence.
Open this, please.
Just personal items. No need to look in there.
And more importantly, a corruptive force which can spread to and corrupt and contaminate the U.S.
The Believers, John Schlesinger, which is a film about the way Santeria comes into a white American community. They use African magic to create power and wealth. But the interesting thing about The Believers is that it was actually used by a drug-running cult as a training film. So it creates this strange loop whereby, and this is another thing, that the cinema becomes part of the mythology too.
Come with me. Come with me and be immortal.
Candyman, huh?
Yes, have you heard of him?
Mm-hmm. You doing a study on him?
Yes, I am. What have you heard?
Another one, but slightly more subtle and nuanced, is Candyman, which brings in the question of folk legends or urban myths.
Typically, we would reserve the term folk horror for stories that take place in rural environments, but I think a strong case can be made for Candyman as a folk horror film because of its liminality, the psychogeographical pull of the Cabrini Green Housing Project itself, and how that connects back to the Reconstruction era folktale.
My apartment was built as a housing project.
No.
Yeah.
What we often find, as in The Believers, the central protagonist is often someone who's studying or researching, who's educated, and they don't really believe in it, but they're deeply interested in it, and their fascination becomes a part of their undoing.
By the Christians it is written that in the Black Myrthian age there existed an addiction to blood among its people.
Ganja and Hess is a 1970s so-called black vampire film made by a great director and writer called Bill Gunn, and it stars Dwayne Jones, who was the lead character in Night of the Living Dead.
Ganja and Hess is a very interesting take on the problem and tension between the rejection of the old and the embrace of the new, because when we look at Hess's plight within this film, what we really see is a problem of assimilation, utter assimilation into modern politics and ideas of race and capitalism and consumerism. And what this film urges is actually a remembrance of the ancestral.
He was an anthropologist. He had those African art around his house and all kinds of objects. So he dealt with old history. He dealt with bones. He dealt with messages from centuries before. So he had developed a whole communication.
It's a misuse of the ancestral that rather emphasizes disconnection rather than connection. And so this curse is the curse of remembering.
It's also about the fact of this return to Africa and Africanist sensibility in the African American community in the late 60s, early 70s. And there's a deep sense of trying to get back to your ancestral roots. So the film is very much about the ambivalence of trying to be a modern American, kind of in a post-racial society, and the impulse also or perhaps the contradictory impulse to try and reclaim your African ancestry. It needs to be seen in relationship to the assassination of Martin Luther King and the ideological conflict in the black community in America at that time between violent, revolutionary, militant politics of the Black Panthers, the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, and the legacy of King, which was a much more passive resistance, Christian way of bringing about change. So it's a film very much about redemption.
There's a tension at the end between his acceptance in the black church and his embrace of the cross. Hess dies not in the church. Hess dies in the shadow of the cross. And if we think about what that shadow means, it's the ways in which this Christian tradition has been manipulated to become a tool of warfare, of racial oppression, of domination. The ways in which the cross has cast a black shadow across cultures that it encounters to erase the ancestral and displace it with white Christianity. This is what kills him.